Hello, my name is Hanna, and this is my review of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, but from now on, we're calling it the Pocket 6K. Now, I've had a pretty interesting history of Blackmagic design. I've actually owned 3 of their cameras. I've owned the production camera 4K, which was this weird box-looking thing, recorded 2.5-inch drives, had a global shutter, so it had horrible low-light performance, but it was awesome. It was 4K for like, what, 2,500 bucks, I think? And then I bought the Ursa Mini 4.6K, which was a fantastic camera. Had some issues in low light, obviously. Huge camera for being a mini. But overall was fantastic. Gave me 4.6K at higher frame rates and recorded the CFast cards, which was bloody expensive back in 2015 and 16 when I had the camera. And then my third camera is the camera I'm currently using, which is the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, which is the baby brother to the 6K, this Pocket 6K. So why was this camera even made? I mean, it was announced, what, like 7-8 months after the 4K? Well, it was essentially because they could. What I found really funny about this camera is it's the highest resolution camera in Blackmagic's lineup. I mean, there's the Ursa Mini 4.6K Pro G2, which was, again, a horrible name, but that only shoots, obviously, 4.6K at high frame rates, but 4.6K nonetheless, so you could really easily get 4K out of it. This is a 6K camera. Now, they do have other cameras like the studio camera, the micro camera, but they're not this. They're not this type of application. So I find it funny that their not most expensive camera actually shoots the highest resolution, but it also kind of shows you that resolution isn't exactly king when it comes to cinema. It's colors, frame rates, form factor, obviously, and mounts. So let's dive into my thoughts and feelings about this Pocket 6K and whether you should buy it or not, and what I actually think about this camera, because it's actually a pretty dang good camera. Now, first of all, let me just situate you if you're a Blackmagic noob. Blackmagic makes 2 pocket cameras, a 4K and a 6K. The 4K uses a micro four thirds sensor and a micro four thirds mount. The 6K is the same body with a slightly, longer flange, essentially, that uses a super 35mm sensor, so your industry standard, which is a horribly used term there, and it uses Canon EF glass because it has a Canon EF mount. So if you have a bunch of Canon lenses, boom, we got your camera right here. If you don't want to adapt, boom, buy this, you're set, you're golden. You get 6K resolution, 50 frames per second raw, and you're golden. You don't need anything else. You have a lot of micro four thirds clash coming from a GH4, GH5, get the 4K, you're golden. Now, if you don't need 6K and you want to save $1,300, you can get the 4K, buy a Metabones for $650, and then boom, you get a camera that shoots 4K RAW, which this camera, oddly enough, can't do, and you get a wider field of view with brighter exposure because it opens up your lens with that speed booster. So that's an interesting thought. So which camera should you buy? Hopefully this video will help you, but let's dive into what this camera is, the Pocket 6K. Again, same form factor, so it's great. But you do get that 6K sensor. So the interesting thing about 6K is you can only shoot 6K in RAW, and the max frame rate is 50 frames per second. You go to 4K, and you can shoot ProRes, and it doesn't window your sensor, but you can't shoot RAW. That's a weird thing. Like, why can't I shoot RAW in a lower resolution? Well, it's because you're processing 6K into 4K because you're not windowing the sensor. On the Pocket 4K, you can shoot RAW or ProRes in basically any resolution you want. This, you can't. If you want 6K, you shoot it in RAW. So if you want to shoot 6K and you want to use 6K to reframe in 4K, buy this camera. If you want to shoot only 4K and you want the most out of your camera, just buy the Pocket 4K. You have Canon glass, adapt. You just got to get used to it. You get better field of view that way anyway, and you can use all your existing lenses. You have Micro Four Thirds lenses, buy the 4K. This camera shouldn't exist in your realm. So let's go ahead and talk about the things that I like about this camera. The form factor, it's okay. I'll actually put that in the things I don't like, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But the buttons and the layout I actually do like about this camera. You get 2 record buttons. They put one here if you want to vlog, which, you know, I don't know if this is really a vlogging camera. It's not heavy, but the lens is, and it, you know, the screen doesn't articulate and everything. So I'm seeing a lot of cons and negatives here. But the buttons are pretty good. You get 3 function buttons. You get a lot of buttons for ISO, shutter speed, white balance. You can take a photo of this camera because technically it is a higher megapixel sensor than the Pocket 4K. You get a high frame rate dedicated button, which is fantastic because I love that. You get a punch in button to punch in for focus. You get a menu button, the play button, and then you get auto exposure and autofocus. This camera can autofocus, it's single shots, and it uses contrast detection, and it's kind of random. So, you know, this is a cinema camera, don't expect it to autofocus for you. It's not gonna have continuous autofocus like dual pixel or Sony continuous or Fujifilm. It's a cinema camera. You're gonna have to learn how to rack focus and how to have good focus. Gotta follow focus on this thing, and again, you'll be golden. Other things I like about this camera is the I/O, actually. You get quite a few selections of I/O, and they're all really, really good. So at the top, you get a microphone input, 3.5 millimeter. You get a headphone output, which is again 3.5 millimeter. You get a full-size HDMI, which is only limited to 1080p out, so don't expect to do external recording this way. Just having an external monitor is nice. And you really don't need more than 1080p because the back screen is also 1080p. You get a 12-volt in, it's an industry standard connector there, and then you have a USB-C out, which you can use to record 2 USB-C drives, which is really awesome. And then you get a mini XLR, and you say mini XLR, that sounds expensive. Actually, it's not. It's like 10 bucks on Amazon to convert from mini XLR to full-size XLR. And the great thing about this camera is it has pretty damn good preamps built right in. You don't have to worry about audio going in because it actually sounds really, really good. Other things I like about this camera is that you have 2 1/4-inch mounting ports, so you can put a external monitor right here or something else, or a microphone. The built-in microphone is actually kind of okay. If you need to just scratch audio, you can do that, and you can record multiple channels of audio built into the camera, so you can record your external input on one and scratch audio on second, so you can have a backup in case something happens with your external audio, which again is awesome. You got to think here, professional cinema camera applications. You need to have redundancies when you're recording. Speaking of redundancies, you also have really good card slots. You get a CFast card slot, which lets you record RAW right into that CFast card. And then you get an SD card, which is a UHS-2 slot. And that lets you record like the lowest ProRes and the highest compression RAW right to an SD card, which is awesome. That kind of wraps up really on the things that I like about this camera in terms of form factor and how to use this camera. Oh, obviously the 5-inch display, it's awesome, except it doesn't articulate, not so awesome. There's other things, this camera has that I'm kind of impartial about. Obviously the display is one of those things. I love it. It has such a big display, but it doesn't articulate, which is a bummer. This power switch kind of feels pretty cheap. It actually kind of feels like a toy. Again, impartial because mine hasn't broken and I don't expect it to break, but just saying, they could have made it a little better. The construction itself, they say, is a carbon fiber polycarbonate blend. It feels like plastic, but it does feel pretty rigid and strong. I haven't seen anyone crack this thing. Let's go talk about the negatives real quick. Form factor is one of my biggest negatives. Again, no articulation of the display. Form factor isn't exactly comfortable, and it's quite an awkward camera. It's not super well designed. It's not a handheld camera, even though it's called a pocket camera. I mean, what pocket is this thing gonna fit in? Not even cargo shorts, and no one should wear those. It does have an audible fan, especially if the 6K is definitely a little bit louder than the 4K because you're generating more heat. So keep that in mind as well if you're shooting in quiet scenes. It's nowhere as loud as like a Red or an Arri or anything like that, but it is more audible than a Sony a7 III because the a7 III doesn't have a fan. 4K is definitely a little bit quieter in that environment. Really, other than that, there's really not much else that I don't like about the function, other than battery life, which there's lack of. It runs off of Canon LP6 batteries. I think that's what they're called. I've never been a Canon shooter. So if you have a ton of those, you'll be fine, but you're getting 20-ish minutes per battery. The battery that comes with the camera is actually generic, and that gets me about 15 minutes on a full charge. And there's not really a warning. It just kind of goes off. It's a little strange. So if you're going to use this camera, you're going to need a power solution. And there's several power solutions. You can get batteries like this guy right here. This is a V-mount. You can use this with a dummy battery and plug it in. You can obviously use that 12 volt in, so you can either plug it into the wall or get a battery plate with like Sony batteries or V-mount or gold mount. Really any batteries. You just have to supply the necessary voltage. So if you're going through this port right here, you need at least 12 volts or 12 to 20. If you're going through the battery, you need 7.4 to like 10 or something like that. The specs are on there. Supply the right voltage, this thing will work. Don't supply the right voltage, it won't work. You might damage something, so make sure you're paying attention to that. I'm using a Sony configuration on mine with a tilt-to battery grip, which is fantastic. It gives me about 2 hours of recording, more enough for me, and I have a ton of those Sony batteries. That's really it in terms of the negatives. So let's talk about the real important stuff, the footage. This camera is by far punching above its weight class and price tag. And this applies for both the 4K and the 6K because the image is pretty similar. It's actually very similar, almost identical. If you adapt to the 4K, you actually get a brighter image with the same exposure settings in this camera because you're using the Metabone speed booster. But out of the box, this camera has a dual native ISO sensor, 400 and 3200. It's just as clean at 400 as it is at 3200, and you get the full 13 stops of dynamic range at both ISO settings. So that makes it actually a pretty decent low light camera. I can shoot comfortably at ISOs 5000 or 6400 and not worry so much about noise on either of these cameras, especially this guy with the bigger sensor. And if you have, moderately fast lens like this 1.8 Sigma, you're gonna have no issues in low light. Now, in bright conditions, stop it down to 400, get some ND on there, and it looks fantastic. You basically want to keep it at those two ISOs because you want to maximize the dynamic range that you get. Now, the test footage that I'm going to show you here is actually pretty dang good. A lot of this was actually overexposed because I can only go up to f/16 on this guy on the Pocket 6K, and I didn't have ND filters that fit this lens. So a lot of the footage that you're seeing is slightly overexposed, but I think these cameras actually tend to like being overexposed. The first thing I want to point out are the colors. I mean, Blackmagic color is awesome. I mean, you got to think about it. The company has made DaVinci Resolve for a long, long time, about, 16 years now. They know colors like no one else. It's the best coloring tool in the business and filmmaking. Everyone uses DaVinci Resolve because it's just simply the best. So they poured a lot of that knowledge into their cameras, and you can really see it like mature in this line of cameras. Their version 4 color science is by far the best I've seen. I mean, I would rank it over Canon and similar on a similar side of Arri. Now, I'm not saying it's as good as Arri. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Arri records 16-bit RAW. This does not. This records 12-bit RAW. You are getting a huge amount of data loss compared to 12-bit and 16-bit. You're actually watching this most likely on an 8-bit panel. So whether it's 10, 12, 14, 16-bit, you're not going to know because you're watching it on a 8-bit panel. If you have a panel that can reproduce all those colors, you're definitely going to know the different gradients of colors. Now, 12-bit is fantastic. Most cameras today record 8-bit because we usually only consume stuff in 8-bit. But this camera gives you an amazing ability at such a small price tag. I mean, at $12.95 for the 4K and $24.95 on the 6K, you're getting 12-bit RAW, and in my opinion, a fantastic codec, which is Blackmagic RAW. Now, B-RAW is what it's called, is compressed RAW. So it's very similar to Red's R3D format and Arri's RAW format. It's essentially RAW, so you get the same kind of file, but instead of Cinema DNG, where it's literally every frame, where it's uncompressed and the files are huge, you can compress your RAW. You can actually shoot more RAW footage than some of the ProRes flavors at the same resolution and frame rates. And that is an amazing ability. Now, obviously, compression will degrade your quality a little bit. So if you want something, if you're shooting something with a lot of motion and you don't want to have a lot of motion artifacts or any chance of that happening, then bump up the compression down to low. So you want 3:1, 5:1, something of that nature. You're recording something like this where I'm moving around the scene, but nothing else is. You could go to 8:1 or 12:1, and it's gonna look fantastic. And it's gonna give you the same latitude as shooting in 3:1 RAW or uncompressed. And that is the magic here with these Blackmagic cameras. No pun intended there, but that's really what makes these cameras so special, is that ability to have that much latitude. In these shots, I mean, you are literally seeing about 13 stops dynamic range, and you're seeing the color science that I would closely compare to an Arri camera. I mean, you could compare it, if you're asking me, it looks very sick, Canon cinema camera or Arri. But I mean, you can literally match those two. I have taken footage straight out of these cameras and with a little bit of adjustment, applied an Arri LUT, and it's looked fantastic. I can make this camera look like Arri Rec 709 any day of the week with minimal effort. Take that from a Sony file or a Fuji file, and you're gonna be struggling because you don't have the bit depth, color information, or the information from the sensor built in. Now, the other benefit of shooting RAW is you make a mistake on the shoot, well, you're not ruined because you mess up on the white balance, you can change that. You mess up on the ISO, you can change that. You can change essentially almost anything with RAW. I mean, to a certain degree, obviously. I mean, you can't recover absolutely nothing, but you overexpose and you go in DaVinci Resolve and all your shadows, all your midtones or highlights blown out, you drag those suckers down and you have information from your sensor. It's fantastic. You can't do that with a baked-in look like you get with ProRes or any of the H.264 or 265 files because the information simply is not there. And that is really the best part of this camera. It's honestly my favorite feature of this camera is the ability to shoot RAW. Now, the other great thing that I love about this camera's looks is skin tones. Blackmagic, again, is very well known for having beautiful skin tones. The highlight roll-off off of skin tones is really one of the easiest ways to know digital versus film. Digital cameras usually have that really harsh, sharp line between like my skin tone and the background. In Blackmagic RAW, and when you're recording 12-bit of information, especially in color and luma, your highlights roll off so gently, like you don't see a hard line. It looks so filmic and cinematic, and that's really what gives it that look, is highlight roll off. You get beautiful midtones, you get beautiful colors. It doesn't add hues to it. I mean, if there's really any hue to it, it actually has a greenish hue, which a lot of cinema cameras do. If you look at any Arri Alexa footage or any Red footage, you'll see a slightly, green to magenta shift sometimes. And that's just how the sensors look. Now, you can easily correct that by changing the white balance a little bit, or adding some warmth, or removing some warmth, or just, taking the full image and adding or subtracting the color that you're seeing. But I mean, out of the box, in that film profile, you get a beautiful image. I mean, it's not super flat. Obviously, you have to do some work to make it look presentable for professional work, but out of the box, you get this beautiful image that just looks and feels cinematic. And you do that with a Sony, even in like a cine profile, and you simply just don't get the same feel. And I don't quite understand why we don't do that. But that's just color science for you. Color science is king when it comes to cinema, and you have the big, like Floyd Mayweather's of the cinema world. You get Airy, you get Red. Airy's very natural. It's, their main mission is to make it look like how we see. So it's very lifelike. And then you get something like Red, which makes something look a little bit more villainous or contrasty or harsh. You get a lot of like TV dramas or crime shows, or shows like Narcos on Netflix. They're all shot on Red. And then you go look at something like the movie 1917, which is all shot on Airy. You get a completely different look. And I would say these cameras, the Blackmagic cameras, I mean, you can adapt them to do both, but out of the box, I think they look more like Airy than they do look like Red. I think it looks more like an Airy Alexa or a Canon C200 or C300 or C500. I think that's the look that you get right out of this camera. Now, you don't have the same latitude as some of those cameras. I mean, Reds can get 17 plus stops dynamic range. The cinema cameras can take, from Canon at least, can do 14, 15 stops, and the Ursa Mini can do 15 stops. Pockets obviously are limited at 13 stops dynamic range, but you get almost, like, I'd say 90% of that look. But you got to remember, this is a $2,400 or $2,500 camera, and the Pocket 4K is a $1,300 camera. An Arri Alexa Mini is like, what, 69 grand, 70 grand? That's a lot more than this camera. And if you're looking at this camera in your price range, you're definitely not looking at an Arri Alexa Mini. So to wrap this up, because I don't want to ramble on in this video, this camera is awesome. I mean, do I recommend it over the 4K? No, I don't. I actually think the 4K is a better value proposition for most people. And I think even if you have Canon glass, you should definitely buy the 4K instead. If you don't want to adapt your lenses, the 6K is an option, but you do give up a couple things like recording 4K RAW, which it's just a letdown. I mean, maybe it'll make that available in firmware in the future, but it hasn't happened yet. Even though the cameras only cost that much money, they're not usable. I mean, they are technically, but they're not. You need to rig it up because this is not a comfortable form factor, and that's okay. I am not expecting a camera of this price range to be, come out of the box and go shoot. Now, a Sony a7 III or whatever, it's out of the box, you can shoot it because it has a grip, it's small, it has stabilization built in. You don't need a whole lot of bells and whistles to make it work. You just need a lens and an SD card. This camera, obviously, yes, you need a lens and you need media, so either SD, C-Fast, or USB-C, which is fantastic. Recording to a T5 saves you a lot of money in the long run in terms of media costs. But you need a rig. You need something to attach things to. So you need a cage. You need something for an external monitor because the screen doesn't articulate. So, even if a camera, like for the Pocket 4K, is $1,300 with media and, external monitor, battery, power solution, you're probably looking at like $2 to $3 grand out of the box and to get up and running with a usable working rig. This camera, it'd be essentially 3 to 4 or maybe 4.5 grand when you're talking about completely ready to go and ready to shoot some really awesome looking footage. These cameras are awkward, so like gimbal mounting can be a little strange. Even though they don't weigh a whole lot, it's honestly just the center of gravity and obviously the shape of this camera. So you'll need like a larger gimbal setup because this camera is just awkward. So you'll have to spend more money on accessories like that. But look, I don't think there's any camera today on the market that gives you the same bang for buck as the 4K and 6K Pocket cameras. Simply put, they're really in a class of their own. The closest camera I can think of maybe is like the Panasonic S1H, and that's a $4,000 camera that uses Leica L glass, which is crazy expensive right now. It does shoot 6K, but only up to like 24 or 30 frames per second, and it records obviously in a much lesser codec. It's compressed H.264, 265 into an SD card. Now that's fantastic for run and gun, and the battery life is fantastic on that camera. It's just not going to give you the same flexibility as much as in RAW. RAW is king, and that's what you have to remember. If you want to color correct and grade, this is the camera for you. Now, if you want to get a camera that shoots right out of the box, this won't be it for you. I mean, there's no continuous autofocus. I mean, it's not a vlogging camera, that's for sure. This is stupid. You shouldn't do this. You know, if you're thinking about doing this for vlogs, get something else. Get something with an articulating display that is smaller, more pocketable, more travel friendly. And obviously that doesn't chew through batteries as much as this thing, because this thing only lasts like 20 minutes on the charge, unless you use external power. So I think I've rambled enough. It's a great camera. It really is. I really, really do recommend this camera. Get the 4K. Honestly, that's my pick for the cameras between the two. If you fall into the categories that I've mentioned, like you want to shoot 6K, that's all you want to do to take advantage of a RAW, this is it for you. This is the only camera in their lineup, at least at this point, that shoots 6K resolution. So pretty easy choice. If you do want to take a look at this camera and maybe buy one, make sure to go drop a visit to my friends at B&H who hooked me up with this loaner for the last couple weeks to use and shoot with it. It doesn't cost you anything to use that link, but it does help me support my channel and making future content. And if you sign up for their Pay Boo card, funny name, you actually save state tax in most states in the US, or sales tax essentially. So you can save a little bit of money when you do buy these cameras, and they have free 2 to 3 day delivery in basically every state except like Alaska and Hawaii, obviously. So sorry for those people who live in those states. All right, to wrap it up, I just want to say thank you so much for watching my Pocket 6K review. I hope you enjoyed the content, and I will help you in your purchasing decisions into your cinema making world. If you have any questions or comments or recommendations for content in the future, drop me a comment below and I will respond to it or make that content very, very shortly just for you. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'll leave all my links below in the description. You all know how YouTube works. Hit the subscribe button, like the video. That will help me out a lot in the analytics. And I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks a bunch.